So clinical trials are, there are two ways to fund clinical trials, and the clinical trials either could be funded through National Institute of Health or NIH. And in order to have anything funded through NIH, one has to write a grant, one has to write specific aims, and then translational research is what is truly needed to really get anything funded through NIH. Again, the funding through NIH has decreased considerably in the past decade, and the grant funding and the grant administration becomes more difficult. The pharmaceutical companies also can fund clinical research. Now, clinical trials are funded through pharmaceutical companies in two ways. Either the pharmaceutical company has a product or a drug that they want to develop for a particular disease, and then it is an industry-sponsored clinical trial that they design with help of some medical advisors, and that clinical trial is most of the times is a registration trial with Federal Drug and Administration, FDA of the United States. And that is usually presented to multiple centers as for availability of participation. Whereas the other mechanism of industry-sponsored clinical trial would be investigator-initiated trial, because I have a research idea that involves that particular drug, and that particular drug I feel is going to be effective in this disease. I would propose a grant to the industry or the pharmaceutical company, and it has a different process of undergoing evaluation and whether they would sponsor that trial or not. So each clinical trial can be anywhere, depending on the number of patients required, can be from $5,000 to $5 million. Mm-hmm. And for, if it is a new study drug, or if it is a new drug, to be able to have that drug provided for a patient without getting the insurance company involvement, it becomes extremely hard, because most of these newer agents, novel study drugs are quite expensive. And it is difficult for the patient's insurance companies to pay for it. Most of the times the indication is not approved by the FDA for the insurance companies to take over. So either the drug is provided by the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company, or it has to be provided by the insurance company. And then it becomes extremely tough. So that's why I think having some funding is of critical importance to really support the clinical trial.
So as coming back as a PhD, a postdoc initially, there is always a push to get your own funding. We operate on, what's the expression, a shoestring most times, and it's as rare diseases, it's very hard, to get funding. So anyways, I've written many grants throughout the years looking for funding. And it's really part of the program as a researcher, as an investigational person, and certainly to advance. That's part of what's looked for. Your own independent support. It never used to be that pharmaceutical companies were an option, right? That's, I would say, only this whole bio company academic relationship has really only been, in my experience over the last 10 or so years, where it's actually encouraged academically, at least here at Boston University. So the process used to be, for you to identify where you thought your research would fit with the mission at the NIH, at the NSA, or with private foundations. Well, so the NIH will tell you these are the criteria, these are the different criteria that they look for in funding, successful applications for funding. How novel is your application? How innovative is it? How significant will the impact of your results be on the population?
Yes, NIH does reject grants, and NIH does not fund grants. Pharmaceutical companies, depending on what their mission is, what their business model is, are going to or not going to approve clinical trials from the investigators. And when that happens, it becomes a little bit tough, it is a little discouraging, but there are foundations, there are endowment funds which are available which can potentially sponsor clinical trials. It is harder to do clinical trials without any funds and without any support from pharmaceutical companies as well as from NIH. So I think going to foundations and going to endowment funds makes it harder and more challenging to support the trial.
Lessons that I learned growing up in science was that science is just like fashion. There are fads that come and go, and if you can learn the lingo, what's hot right now to use in terms of terminology, that's one of the strategies that you should take. Cutting